Okay, thank you. Thank you, Tita, for representing MDI and hosting this talk today, and thank you, Edgar, for IDRC's support. And I'm very pleased to be part of the MDI IDRC lecture series. Can everyone hear me okay in the back there? Yeah? It's loud enough? Okay. As Edgar mentioned, my background is both as an academic. I'm a labor economist at the University of Ottawa, and I work on employment issues in developing countries. But at the same time, I have one foot in the policy world where I have been engaged through a lot of country-level work, both at the World Bank and also in the kinds of activities that IDRC sponsors that Edgar talked about. So what I'm hoping I can do in my talk is combine some of the analytical work that labor economists do about employment with some real experiences I've had over the years at the country level actually dealing with difficult issues around job creation. And what I want to do today is really talk about how to think about job creation strategy. And I'm going to make three basic points. One is that countries have to be very clear on what they hope to achieve through their job creation strategies. Job creation strategies don't happen on their own. Many countries think that as long as they grow rapidly, and I'm aware that this is a period of rapid growth in Myanmar, but a growth strategy by itself is not a job strategy. So I want to make it clear that it's very important for countries to develop their own job strategy, okay, distinct from a growth strategy. The second thing I want to emphasize is that in developing a job strategy, it's critical for you to understand the dynamics of what's happening in your own country's labor market. So the role of data and analysis is absolutely critical. And this is something that IDRC tries to promote through its research. Hopefully MDI can make a major contribution through its work. And certainly in my work at the World Bank, a lot of it has to do with supporting countries in doing the analysis that's required to really understand what's happening in your own country. Because job strategies are not universal. There's a very strong element of country-specific strategies required. So that's my second point, that you really have to understand your own country. And the third point I want to make with respect to job strategies has to do with the fact that it needs to be a multi-sector approach. Ministries of labor, for example, cannot by themselves develop and implement a job strategy. Ministries of labor are important, but there are many other considerations that need to be involved, and I hope to be able to illustrate some of this today. And this often involves not only government but industry and workers, but also other ministries besides the Ministry of Labor are often very important players in developing job strategies. So I'm going to try to talk for maybe 30 or 40 minutes today. No more than 40 minutes, because I know that I get very boring after 40 minutes. So I'll try to keep it to 30 or 40 minutes. And hopefully then we can have a very good discussion. But if during the course of my presentation there's something you want to clarify, something from one of the slides, for example, that is not totally clear, please feel free to ask me a question to clarify. And I really hope that the effectiveness of this lecture will really depend a lot on the kind of discussion that the slides I show generate in terms of your own questions and our own discussion. So I'm going to cover 5 things today in my talk. The first has to do broadly with how job creation fits into development. And here, as Edgar mentioned, I was one of the authors of the World Bank's World Development Report on Jobs in 2013. And they developed a very holistic framework to thinking about jobs. So I'm just going to briefly talk about that as the starting point for my lecture. And then I've been already mentioned the word job many, many times, so I want to spend a few minutes talking about what do we mean when we talk about a job, and what is a good job? Because often I think we have preconceptions about what a good job is, and that can really differ depending on the country context. Then I'm going to get into the policy area. And again, going back to the World Development Report, we developed what we call a policy triangle to illustrate the key components of a job strategy. And I'm going to talk about this policy triangle. But then I'm going to really focus on country-specific priorities. A job strategy in Myanmar is going to look very different than a job strategy in Singapore, which is going to look very different than a job strategy in my own country, Canada, for example. So I want to talk a little bit about country-specific priorities. And then finally, if we have time, I've been doing a little bit of work on the particular question of labor force participation of women, which is seems like a separate topic, but if I have time to summarize our work in that area, I'm going to do it. First of all, because the participation of women is a very important part of job strategies in the first place. But second of all, I think it illustrates a couple of things that I hope, be able to communicate as messages of my talk. One is the usefulness of data and analysis in generating effective policy solutions. And second of all, this point I've already mentioned, that often the most important elements of a job strategy, in the case of women, for example, may well involve things that we don't traditionally think about as part of labor policy. Okay? So that's just a quick roadmap to what I'm going to talk about today. So let me get started with the World Bank framework. So in the World Development Report, we tried to make one major point, and that is that job creation is absolutely critical for development. And in a sense, this is obvious. Whatever countries I've worked in, policymakers want advice on how to create jobs. They're very conscious of the fact that to meet the needs of their citizens, job creation is one of the most important things they need to do. And there are many, many different ways that an effective job creation strategy can contribute to a country's development. Certainly, living standards. Obviously, earnings are the most important source of income for almost all households, so the extent to which you can develop jobs that have high levels of earnings, you're going to contribute to a country's living standards. Jobs also contribute to productivity because there's an enormous learning process that goes on when people work. And the more people are engaged in jobs that allow them to learn, develop further, pick up additional skills, the more that is going to contribute to a country's economic development, productivity, and growth. And the third thing that labor economists don't typically talk about, but we emphasize a lot in the World Development Report, is the relationship between jobs and social cohesion. That by participating in the labor market, by working in activities that contribute to the development of a country, people get involved in the mainstream of the social and economic current of the country. And much of the problem, for example, in many countries with young people now, we can directly link to the fact that there aren't employment opportunities and they don't feel like they can benefit from or contribute to the social and economic mainstream of society. So when people participate in the labor market in jobs that they value, they tend to become more engaged in the communities they're involved in. They tend to develop stronger connections with the country's institutions. They tend to value their participation in the society and contribute more to the society more than people who always remain on the outside of the labor market. So as a starting point, I just want to underline, and this is something I'm sure everyone in this room already believes in, but I want to underline the importance of jobs, not only as a way that people achieve the living standards they need, but the impacts of jobs are much more widespread than that. Now, so I've talked about jobs. I want to talk a little bit about what we mean by a job. And a lot of times when we think about jobs, we're thinking about a wage employment position, where you're working for an employer for a wage, ideally in the formal sector where you're participating in social insurance programs and so on. But in fact, in much of the world, that's not what a job is for most people. So this looks at the breakdown of employment among the major developing regions of the world, and it just divides that employment into farming, people working in agriculture, and most often people who work in agriculture are working in a family production unit. The second is self-employment, and the third is wage employment. So if you look at these bars, depending on what part of the world you're looking at, the composition of employment is very, very different. And this is an important starting point for thinking about what a job is and what kind of strategies we need to improve people's working lives. So in Europe and Central Asia, for example, it's true that when we think about a job, for the vast majority of the labor force, that is a wage employment job. People are working for an employer for a regular wage or salary. But when we go to some regions like East Asia and Pacific, which is the region that Myanmar is in, that wage employment sector is much smaller. And important segments of the labor force are either working in farming or are working in self-employment. And when we think about this specifically for Myanmar, here I'm using data from the World Bank. They have an upcoming report on jobs in Myanmar. They have some data where they have broken down the working population in detail, depending on exactly what it is people are doing. And here's the breakdown for Myanmar based on the 2015 survey on poverty and living standards. And again, this is the first point I want to make, that you need to have empirical evidence in order to start to think about what the labor market looks like and ultimately what policies are going to address the issues that people need to address. So in Myanmar, I'm just organizing the distribution of employment into three broad categories. The first is the percentage of the workforce that's in family farming. So this is not including agricultural workers who are in wage employment for an agricultural employer. These are people working on family farms. And that's over a third of the working population, 35% of the population. The second group, up in the upper left-hand corner, are people who are working in household businesses, but not in agriculture. And that's 26%. So when we think about wage employees, and I'm including people who are working in wage relationships in agriculture, that's only 40% of the workforce, 39% of the workforce. So this traditional notion we have of a job being earning a wage or a salary from an employer only describes the situation for 39% of the working population in Myanmar. So as we think about job strategies, we need to think about the fact that 60% of the people in this country are not working in that type of employment relationship. But the jobs they have are equally valuable, and in some cases the jobs they have may even be better than the traditional notion of a wage employment job. So let me turn to that. I've been working recently with some new data that was collected by the ILO and Gallup. So every year Gallup does a world poll. and they ask a common set of questions to a representative sample in, I think it's 142 countries around the world. And in 2016, the ILO partnered with Gallup, and they asked some specific questions, additional questions on employment. So we have all of the data from the annual Gallup World Poll, which asks a really wide range of questions. Plus we have an additional set of questions on employment that the ILO put in. So this is a very interesting source of data, and this is what I use for the analysis I'm just going to show you. And later on, if I have time to get into the question of female labor force participation, I'm going to return to this data. So what we did with this ILO Gallup data was we had data for 4 countries: Myanmar, Thailand, Cambodia, and Vietnam. So 4 countries in what we call the Mekong region. And what I wanted to do was compare the lives of people who are in wage employment, self-employment, whether they're full-time or part-time, whether they're unemployed or out of the labor force. So all of the different statuses they might have in the labor force. I wanted to see how these different groups of people compared according to some variables that we don't usually have in labor market analysis. So the Gallup poll asks people how satisfied they are with their lives. And they ask people to rate their life satisfaction on a scale from 1 to 10, where 1 is like not satisfied at all, where life is very difficult and they're very unsatisfied, to a life satisfaction of 10, where life is perfect, and I don't know who would rate their life as 10, but presumably there are some people who do. So, what I wanted to see was, okay, like our traditional notion, and certainly as a labor economist, my assumption would have been that people in regular wage employment that have the security of wage employment would probably score higher on a life satisfaction measure than someone who only worked part-time or who was unemployed or was self-employed. And so we did a regression analysis to try to, so we controlled for all kinds of other factors, and we tried to isolate the impact of employment status on life satisfaction, and we compared it to the life satisfaction reported by full-time wage employees. And interestingly, we found that in a statistically significant way, self-employed people assess their lives at a higher level of satisfaction than wage employment, and part-time employees assess their lives at a higher level of satisfaction than full-time wage employees. So this was kind of surprising, and again, not something I would have predicted. Another interesting variable that's in the Gallup data, which we don't have in traditional labor force surveys, is they asked people, how was their day yesterday? And they asked them, did you feel anxious? Did you feel happy? Did something good happen to you? Did something bad happen to you? Did you feel well or did you feel ill? And they score people on how they assess how positive their day was the day before the survey. And again, this is not something I learned in graduate school in economics, variables like this, but it, ultimately, as people concerned about policy, we are concerned about what will help people have better experiences in their lives. And here, too, we compared employment status against the standard of full-time wage employment. And we found that, again, self-employed people said that their day yesterday had been more positive than full-time employees. Part-time employment also was associated with a more positive daily experience, and people who were out of the labor force, not unemployed, but out of the labor force. Everyone understand the distinction between being unemployed and out of the labor force? So these are people who are not looking for jobs. They also had a more positive day, the day before the survey, than full-time wage employees. Then the last thing we looked at in this work was how healthy people were. So this is based on their self-report. We asked people, how they would rate their personal health. And again, self-employed people and part-time people reported their personal health as more positive than full-time wage employees did. Now, the reason that I emphasize this, and I think that this is interesting work, and we're not the only people who are finding this kind of thing. There's some very interesting work being done in Africa, for example, that has also found this, probably with better research methods than I have. As a labor advisor, I would often go into government departments, and regardless of the level of development, the policymakers, their model was, how can we create more full-time wage employment? And that's totally understandable, and if I was a minister of labor, I probably also would have had that prior. But when you start to look at data, you start to raise some questions about, well, what exactly is the kind of employment we want to encourage, okay? And this doesn't answer it all for me, but it starts to give me some indication that I may want to have a broader view of job creation than the most traditional, stereotypical view of trying to increase the formal wage sector. So let me talk a little bit about growth and job creation. I had mentioned at the beginning of the talk that growth strategies and job creation strategies are not the same things. So let's think about job creation in this region of the world. So Southeast Asia, and I would include East Asia in this as well, has been probably the most successful region in the developing world in terms of job creation. And I know with my students, when I often give them an exercise to pick a country that had sustained growth and improvements in living standards and reductions in poverty, and more often than not, the cases that they come back are from this region or from East Asia. So this, in many ways, has been a very successful region. And the model of economic development that you all, I'm sure, know very well is one that has been based on structural transformation. That countries have gone from a largely traditional rural economy and moved into more of a modern, often urban economy. And this describes, first, the earliest wave of economic development after World War II in Japan, and then there was a second wave of the Four Tigers, Korea, Singapore, Hong Kong, and Taiwan. And then we had the successful structural transformation in Malaysia, for example, and then there was China, and now there's the new wave of countries in the region, Myanmar, Cambodia, Vietnam, that to greater or lesser degrees are showing a similar type of economic dynamism. And the basic model in this region has been one of, first of all, increasing productivity in agriculture, which raises people's living standards in rural areas, but it also starts to free up labor for migration to the modern sector. Then the second stage is the migration of resources, people, financial resources into urban areas. And then the third stage is upgrading urban industries from entry-level, low value-added, low productivity wage sectors, garments and textiles being the classic example, to gradually higher productivity, higher value-added industries, and ultimately into very sophisticated industries, which is where Japan, Singapore, Hong Kong, for example, are now. So this is the model of development that really has worked quite well in raising living standards and creating better and better jobs in much of this region. But there's a question about whether this model will be the recipe for success for the latest generation of Southeast Asian countries, including Myanmar. And I can't pretend to say I have the answer for that, but there are lots of reasons to wonder if this model may be unfolding differently than it did, let's say, in the 1960s, 1970s, 1980s. We have Industry 4.0 and the impact of technological change. We have different trading patterns. All of this has implications for job creation in very different ways than the environment was that Japan or the Four Tigers or even Malaysia faced. And there is a feeling, for example, that the potential for creating manufacturing and industry jobs in urban areas that will improve people's living standards, raise their productivity, and do all the good things that urban job creation in modern sectors is supposed to do. There are more and more people who are wondering exactly how much scope there is for in the future. And a very well-known American economist named Danny Roderick has come up with the term he calls premature deindustrialization. So the notion of premature deindustrialization is, so in this traditional model that I've described for this region, so you go from agriculture to urban jobs, and the urban jobs start out being low wage, low productivity, and then gradually countries upgrade into high wage, high productivity jobs. And then eventually, as wages get really high and as countries' human capital gets really high, manufacturing starts to decline and countries move into service economies. Okay, so that's the last stage in this modernization story. So my country, for example, Canada, which has a very high GDP per capita, almost 80% of the workers are in the service sector now. So we've had a deindustrialization where because of our cost structure and because of the very high level of human capital, they become essentially knowledge-based service economies. So they become deindustrialized economies. The same is true of the United States, which largely explains the election of Donald Trump as the president, because he basically put forward a campaign that said he can halt that process and maintain. There is a point at which countries start to move out of manufacturing and industry and move into the service economy. And what happened was that earlier generations of countries they started their deindustrialization at very high levels of income, and they moved into services when they were already quite rich. And the countries at the right-hand side of this chart, you see like Germany, Great Britain, Sweden, Italy, Denmark, all of the Western OECD countries. This indicates how rich they were when they started to deindustrialize and move out of manufacturing and into this service economy. But as time went on, that peak, when the amount of manufacturing employment reached its peak, started happening at lower and lower levels of income. So you can see that Brazil, Mexico, Argentina, for example, they reached their peak in terms of manufacturing employment at lower levels of income. As you move to the left of this chart, it means you reached your peak at a lower level of income. And Roderick and some of these other people are arguing that for the latest industrializing countries,